All right, so this is for my 1020 class, World History 1020. We got to a certain point in notes on this Thursday. We're still trying to make it through that first chapter and get everybody caught up. Make sure you have your textbooks, and hopefully, most of the stuff that I'm about to cover again in this little quick video, you will recognize from your notes in last class. That being said, because I went on a small tangent regarding the effects of the Black Death in a European economy or world economy, as we then talked about, we did not quite get to the end of the chapter and the notes that I had planned. However, I do not want to waste more time. I say waste, spend more of our time in class going over just the first chapter. We have a lot of ground to cover, and yeah, we better go ahead and keep on moving forward. So, with that, this is just kind of a general overview and catching up of the last little bit that we didn't quite get to in class. It is mostly straight from your textbook. I throw in little factoids that I've learned through my studies and reading along the way, but in general, throughout this class, I will be following and using information found almost exclusively in your textbook. So, with that, let me get a sip of my coffee if I can find it. One moment. It wouldn't be Mr. Warren's class without him having a cup of coffee, would it? So, with that in mind, let's get started again. I am going to go back to circa 1498, seaward trade or sea-borne trade with Asia from what is, I guess, now Europe. And Vasco da Gama rounds the Cape from the western side and sails down to India, negating the overland Silk Road. Very good. Remember the Chinese and their Silk Road trading routes? Well, they are about to become a lot less relevant. Not irrelevant, but eventually supplanted by a much, much safer, or at least easier in some capacities, form of travel, sea travel, where you can carry larger amounts of goods and avoid taxes, among other things, but we'll get around to it. So, Portugal's capital of Lisbon becomes the new trading hub for much of Europe, and as that is where goods go to and from, obviously it grows in wealth immeasurably. Spain follows Portugal in the concept of, hey, we should probably send some people abroad and find some raw goods and, well, hey, some new routes to the Far East so we can negate the Silk Roads ourselves. All of this is, a good idea for Spain as well. So Spain sent a guy that I think we covered in class pretty well, Christopher Columbus, 1492, to negate the Silk Road and the overland trading routes to China. He actually thought he was going to make it to China, and on August 3rd, he departed from Spain. August 12th, he arrived in, well, what he called San Salvador, modern day the Bahamas. Yeah, kind of went the wrong way. Did again set sail, and October 28th landed in what we call today Cuba, and asked Portugal's crown, 1483, to have sent him on the same trip. Well, they decided not to. In historic retrospect, probably not their best idea. Spain certainly makes out like a bandit for this. Columbus, on the other hand, still thought he had found China, or at least, was on his way. What he did find was small villages, no gold, and certainly no China. Leaving there, he landed on Hispaniola, or what he then named Hispaniola, in December. And upon returning to Spain, Columbus told all of his great stories about the things he had found and had brought back some goods. And yeah, so upon returning to Hispaniola on one of his later voyages, though, Columbus decided to enslave its population and was, somehow surprised when they decided to rebel against his rule. Yeah, go figure. I believe I did mention this in class. Pope Alexander VI then issues the Treaty of Tordesillas, which is in your vocab list. Please look into it. And what this did was for, well, Christians, read into that a lot of what it is, because monotheistic religions have a way of looking down on polytheistic religions at the point in history that we're talking about. It's going to come and play a big role in this. Christians monotheistic though they are, also had a way of looking down on each other, Catholics and Protestants being a prime example. But in this case, the Treaty of Tordesillas, again, Pope Alexander VI, established boundaries for the Christian kingdoms of Spain and Portugal, and kind of their boundaries that they were allowed to each expand into as they crossed the Atlantic into what was becoming the new and discovered world. So, spice trade in India still made Portugal richer than Spain. Well, that doesn't sit well with Spain, right? So in 1519, Charles I, or as he was also a Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V, by that title, decides to send Ferdinand Magellan to find the fastest route to, you guessed it, China. Still trying to overcome those Silk Road Chinese trade routes, but Magellan and his large crew round South America and begin to explore the Pacific. Not on purpose, I don't think, but weather, disease, violence in the Pacific Islands killed all but 18 of his men, including him, so Magellan died on this voyage. However, one ship did return after 3 long years at sea, having discovered that, as was suspected, it wasn't thought to be flat, but, history and science debates still go on. You got flat earthers out there to this day. Not going to talk about that right now, but Magellan's long and, for him, deadly voyage ended after 3 years in discovering that, yes, the earth is round. If you go that way, you will come back from that way, so long as you can find your way through, and around. However, we need to talk about the New World very briefly before all of this exploration started, just to make sure that this is in your notes. It is currently estimated that between 50 to 65 million people lived throughout the New World. Now, that is from what we think of the north of North America through Central and South America. That is a very large number, but, spread out over a very large area. So, we now need to talk about the age of exploration, again, from the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. And the fellas that they sent, and I say fellas, colonialism started at this time with exclusively men. However, once you have some of these earliest men come in and establish that, hey, this isn't such a bad place to live, of course you start then importing some of your families and women from back in the original, European countries. So with that, we'll get to it. You have a lot of social and racial hierarchies that get formed out of that concept. But back to the beginning. First, we have to have the conquistadors. Now, those are the people that you've likely heard of at some point in your historical education. But the first one that we are going to talk about is Cortez. So, Cortez lands in Mexico April 21st, 1519. Now, again, set this coffee down. He is interested in, many things, as, whatever came along, but generally speaking, riches, wealth, and discovery. You never go discovering unarmed at this point in history, which, again, ... will be very important later on. As we discussed in notes in class, the Portuguese had adapted Chinese gunpowder technology and cannon technology and put it on their boats, their caravels, as they were exploring. Obviously, the implication is if you need it, at least you have it. Cortez and a lot of the conquistadors were not quite so laid back about their armaments. They came in full regalia, the equivalent of body armor for the day, the most modern weapons, steel weapons, very important there, combustible weapons, guns. So they really, really, really out-technologied, if that's a term, it is now, out-technologied the Aztecs. Now, the Aztecs are, in fact, the empire of what is now Mexico, or Mexico and surrounding areas. You get the idea. But when Cortez landed, the leader of the Aztec Empire, a guy by the name of Montezuma II, or the second rather, not two, sorry, let's not go down that route. But Montezuma II, he was, and his city of Tenochtitlan, which I massacre the name, but roughly in modern day Mexico City, same general area. Um, Montezuma II sent an envoy to go and meet Cortez and his men. This was initially, kind of just that exploration of, hey, we've seen these boats arrive on our shores. We kind of want to know who is coming on shore to potentially, either way, you get the idea. Montezuma and the Aztec Empire sent out some folks to go and meet Cortez. Cortez quickly allied with the neighboring city state. And this is after, a couple of small interactions where Cortez realizes that these Aztec warriors, well, they might not be as well armed, but numerically speaking, it would not be a fair fight. Cortez knows that he would have been wiped off the map if he had tried to take Tenochtitlan, their capital city, or dethrone the king, Montezuma II, on their first, or as it happened, second or third meeting. But Cortez was no fool. He knew that the Aztec Empire was renowned for being violent. Yeah. So in that violence dictated by the government on top, so not Montezuma II necessarily, but him too, he was viewed as a deity. So rather like other societies that we have studied or will study later in this class, when you give a leader the standing of a god, there's not a lot of questioning that goes on. Not none, but not a lot. So those leaders tend to get away with, ruling through violence when other cultures might not accept that because, again, they're divine. This is divine violence, so what they say goes. Well, you take that concept and multiply it over hundreds of years, and your culture gets very violent. And not that you don't have a stable culture where you don't see the violence all the time, but anytime you go out and try to conquer your neighbors and you have a violent culture that is your own, they typically receive the brunt end of that. Now, that doesn't make good allies. That makes people that are your slaves in some case. But if another person comes along, in this case, Cortez, and decides to ally themselves with the people around the Aztec Empire, smaller city states or kingdoms, that have been ground under the boot heel of the Aztec Empire, well, you can see how they might rather be allies to Cortez and fight the Aztecs on behalf of Cortez. Well, guess what? This is, in fact, what happens. And in 1521, or by 1521, if you prefer, a very large army of about 1,000 Spanish, complete with horses, firearms, cannons, steel weapons, again, but more importantly, thousands upon thousands of other indigenous tribes and peoples who were not happy with the Aztecs banded together and, you guessed it, by 1521, took down Montezuma II's empire and kind of spelled the downhill slide of the Aztec Empire itself. Again, there's frequently not one decisive battle where you go, on this date, the Aztec Empire completely ended. No. There is, of course, smaller battles after, 1521. And in that, there's also a secondary killer introduced by Cortez and his men and previous and subsequent explorers to the New World. We've talked about it a lot. We'll talk about it a bit more. It is the effects of disease. So in this case, smallpox that came across from the Old World, from Europe, decimated, and actually, that's far too kind, wiped out, call it 85 to 90% of the Aztecs, as well as all of the other indigenous people that had no immunity to smallpox. However, when you fight a much weakened force, the Aztecs having been sick, with your strong and disease-resistant army, well, even though numerically speaking it was 500 Aztecs to every one Spaniard, it was still so mismatched that the Spanish came out on top. Or the Spanish and, again, importantly, indigenous people's army that they helped to combine and raise or coalesce and rays from the surrounding areas. Okay, so you think it was bad for the Aztecs in Mexico? Wait until we get to the Incas in Peru, or Peru and surrounding areas. So they inhabited, they being the Peruvian, or not Peruvian, excuse me. Whew, coffee, y'all. They inhabited what is called the Incan Empire, and from their capital city of Cuzco. This encompasses modern day Ecuador, Chile, Peru, and had nearly at its peak 16 million inhabitants. Again, a lot of people, very populous place. In fact, some of their cities, rather like the Aztecs, so impressed the invaders that when it came time to establish colonies, I mean, disease had killed 90%, and military effort had killed most of the other indigenous tribes and people. So, why not use their architecture? It was nice. Their roads and bridges were just as solid as the ones in European nations and city states and kingdoms at the time, in large part. And yeah, again, the Aztec Empire, the Incan Empire, they were definitely further ahead in engineering and architectural feats than I think a lot of people give them credit for. Um, Tenochtitlan, or Mexico City, the Aztecs again, was established in a very tiny island and basically became a floating city in no small part, in that you had concentric circles being built up and canals connected all of these different parts of the concentric circles that went out from the center. Of course, in that layout, you have the most religious centers and political centers in the middle, or the center. And then you have residential and other things in the concentric circles going out from the center. So that was the Aztecs. The capital city of Cuzco for the Incan Emperor, or Incan Empire rather, was governed and ruled. So this is the first time we see, sorry to digress, a division of, you have one large kingdom, right? But it's hard to get information to all four corners quickly. You need to have divisions within your kingdom where people are in charge of each of those divisions, and then they report to the top person in charge. We still have similar concept now. Think of a nation with 50 states, right? So with that in mind, the four provinces or four areas were established, and yeah, like I said, it made governing much, much more doable from a central point. But how do you transfer information? With writing? No, no. The Incans did not have a writing system. Instead, they had what is called a kyphus, or kyphus. I'm not sure where to put the emphasis on that. But imagine different colored strings with different knots, or I guess different patterns of knots in them. That was their form of writing for things like, numbers, information storage, not a lot of literature, no literature in this case, but records keeping. They didn't have writing, they knotted ropes. However, still effective, doesn't matter. So, in that, they were, very devout record keepers, and your book goes a little bit more in depth into some of their other, I guess, inventions that were common to the Incan Empire. Gold was not an invention, but certainly one of their highlighting features, a fact that will come into play with the conquistadors here very shortly. So, the Spaniards under Pizarro landed in Peru on May 13th, 1532. At that same time, again, you had uh, differing provinces that were now being brought together. And again, the new leader who was taking control, or marching to Cuzco to take control that day, Atahualpa, um, what was again on May 13th, the same day that Pizarro and his men land, is traveling to Cuzco to basically become the brand new emperor of the Incan Empire. So, with that in mind, not good timing to be Atahualpa. To claim his crown, and he wanted to basically end the civil war that had been going on. So, at the time Pizarro landed, South America was conquered in just about 20 to 25 years. So, just remember how little time this takes in the grand scheme of things when we're talking about arrival of the conquistadors. And I mean, really, if you want to dial it back to the age of exploration from Columbus on forward to the conquistadors, within 20, 25 years, all of the indigenous cultures and, you know, both of the Incan and Aztec empires that we're talking about in class, both of them would have been wiped out from military expansion and disease, or nearly entirely wiped out. You still have indigenous peoples that survive, of course, but they are then going to become subject to religious expansions of the European conquistadors more so than military. However, in this same note, Portugal became very interested in what we now know as Brazil. They wanted to grow sugarcane. Sugar was an incredibly profitable commodity. Um, and with that in mind, you can find sugar in many different plants. You can find it from honey. You can find it from, many different sources. However, sugarcane grew very well, or grows still to this day, ostensibly, very well in the climate provided by Brazil. Now, when the conquistadors decided that, hey, we're going to start growing sugarcane in Brazil, well, the indigenous peoples were great to make into slaves. I mean, in a horrible way of saying so, but great to make into slaves until they all started dying off. Well, when that happens, sugarcane and sugar production is an incredibly tedious and labor intensive process. So, what did the conquistadors do? You guessed it, they started bringing in African slaves. So, more on that later. But I think I hear my child crying, so I'm going to put a pause on this real quick, and I will be right back.